I was listening to Colin Coward the other day, and he said that conference realignment is good for the sport because there has been a shortage of great games in college football over the last couple of years. And with these new super conferences that are starting to form in the Big Ten and the SEC, that's going to lead to more great games being played. And I think that that is a pretty solid point. I do get tired of seeing schools like Alabama playing against Kennesaw State and paying FCS teams to blow them out. But I don't think that college football has an overall shortage of great games or marquee matchups. I think there are a lot of great games that have been played over the last couple of years, but nobody really talks about them unless they are games that have a big impact on the college football playoff picture. Last year, Washington and Oregon State played at one of the best games of the college football season, and nobody really talked about it. It was a very phenomenal game. Everybody only paid attention to the games that had playoff impact. And that's the problem with college football right now. I don't think college football has a shortage of great games. Colin Coward in that segment, he said that the only games that have him the most intrigued is Colorado TCU and LSU versus FSU, but there are other great week one matchups like Florida versus Utah. That game has very big implications. Florida is a team that nobody expects to be that good this year, so if they could go on the road and pull off a big upset win against Utah, do you know how much momentum they would have to start the season? That would be a season-altering win if Florida was able to pull off that victory early in the season. What about Duke and Clemson? Nobody's talking about Duke and Clemson because nobody views Duke as a legitimate playoff contender. And even though Duke isn't one of those teams that probably is going to be in the playoff conversation, they're a team that's going to be really good this year. They had a new head coach last year and they won 9 games with them. And they very well could pull off the upset about Clemson. What about Nebraska, Minnesota? Matt Rule making his Nebraska debut. UNC versus South Carolina. You got 2 Carolina programs facing off week 1 in a rivalry matchup. Drake May versus Spencer Rattler. I mean, come on. You mean to tell me that these aren't games that don't really have a lot of excitement? And here's the thing. Let's say college football had about 10 great games or 10 big games every single weekend, right? How would you be able to watch them all when most of the times you'll have several great games or big games on at the same time? You look on ESPN at 3:30 p.m. and there's the SEC Game of the Week on ESPN and also the SEC Game of the Week on CBS. College football doesn't do a great job at spacing out their big games. You can't have several big games in the same window because you're going to split your audience. I can't watch 4 games at one time. Well, you can if you got the ESPN app and you use a little split screen thing, but still, most people like to watch 1 game at a time. Somebody like me who pays attention to 5 games at one time, it kind of makes it hard to keep up with everything, take everything in. The coverage of the college football playoffs has been the biggest reason why a lot of games that used to be viewed as big in the past have started to lose their meaning. Rivalry games have kind of lost their luster. I don't feel like the Iron Bowl hits the same anymore like it used to be. The Iron Bowl has been a classic the last couple of years, and what's made the Iron Bowl so appealing is that even though Alabama is always so dominant, you wonder if Auburn is going to be able to hang in like how they did a couple of years ago when they took Alabama to 4 overtime periods on a down year. There are plenty of great games that get played in college football every single week. You just can't look at the Georgias and Alabamas of the world and say there's not a lot of great games because those teams are playing FBS opponents. Find teams that are playing against great competition then. There's always great games. You see, a great game isn't always defined by who's the most highest ranked or who has the best storylines. People are intrigued with TCU Colorado because of Deion Sanders being there. But let's face it, if Deion Sanders wasn't at Colorado, why would that game have any national intrigue? Honestly, you're kind of watching that game because of Coach Prime. I wouldn't really include that on my list of great games to watch for week 1 of the college football season, man, because Colorado, this is a program that only won one game last year. TCU is coming off a college football playoff berth. So therefore, I wouldn't consider that a great game. And the last time I checked the odds, TCU was favored to beat Colorado by at least 19 points. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just saying you could look at that game and say that's not a great game. But you have intrigue in that because of Deion Sanders, because of the storylines. And you could make any college football game a potential great game by just looking at the storylines. And you just can't decide if a game is going to be great or not by just looking at the teams who are going to be playing in it, because you have a team that's really good end up in a close game against a team that isn't also great. Georgia was in some dogfights last season with Missouri and Kent State. Those were pretty good games, and you wouldn't have thought, because when you see Georgia, Kent State on the schedule, you think it's going to be a one-sided affair. You see, one thing that makes college football so great compared to the NFL is that any given Saturday, you're capable of seeing a big upset. And you can see upsets in the NFL, but I don't think upsets hit the same in the NFL as they do in college football. When Tennessee pulled off the upset against Alabama, it just felt different. It was just a different atmosphere. You know, the fans just acted differently. They acted like Tennessee won the damn national championship when they upset Alabama. Meanwhile, if you see an upset in the NFL, you know, it's like you get a little excited about it, but after a couple of days, like it's on the next week. People are still talking about Tennessee's upset over Alabama to this day. And, you know, somebody in the comment section said that they need a red zone type channel for college football where they show you every game red zone play. They do. You see, like, the problem with college football is just that there are so many games out there that the ones that have a lot of appeal, they end up being in the same time slot as other marquee matchups. So it kind of splits your attention. And for the night games, the 8 p.m. games that get played on ABC in prime time, you also have other good games being played in that same time slot or an hour later on Fox. So college football has to do a better job at, you know, marketing and emphasizing their marquee matchups. You know, don't have a lot of great teams playing big games at the same time. Try to space them out a little bit so you don't split your audience and everybody can just key in on one game. Like, the one reason why I love watching Ohio State and Michigan play so much is because they play early in the day at 12 o'clock and no other big time rivalry games were getting played at that time. So you look at the game, even if it didn't have college football ramifications or college football playoff ramifications, people would still tune in, people would still watch it because people are drawn towards Michigan and Ohio State. People have made college football too much about the playoffs and not enough about the individual matchups anymore. What about the rivalries? What about Oregon State and Oregon? That was a great game. That was one of the best games of the college football season last year, and nobody talked about it because the only team that has something to lose in many people's eyes was Oregon because they were in the college football playoff race. But nobody talked about how Oregon State was on pace to have their first 10-win seasons in years. You feel me? Like, we kind of have made college football all about the playoffs, and that's why a lot of these games have lost their luster because you're only intrigued to the games that are going to impact how the playoff picture looks. We need to make these rivalry games go back to actually meaning something. We need to put more coverage on games that may not have college football playoff teams, but at least two teams that potentially could make it to a New Year's Six bowl game or a team that's competing for their first 10-win season in years. You know, like, I don't think there's a shortage of great games in college football. There have been plenty of great games played. Hell, last year, Kansas versus Oklahoma was a pretty good game. What about TCU versus Texas? Hell, any game that TCU played in last year seemed to be a classic. So I think there are a lot of great games that are on every single week. You just can't say, oh, like, this isn't a great game because it doesn't excite you. You have to actually see how the game plays out first. Because I promise you, if you watch Texas A&M and Appalachian State, you were pretty glued to that game because you wanted to see if Appalachian State was going to be able to pull off the upset against Texas A&M. Same thing with Marshall against Notre Dame. We were thunderstruck when Marshall upset Notre Dame the way they did. You see, great games aren't tied to a brand or a team, and it's not tied to college football playoff implications. Great games are just, are you going to have a game that comes down to the wire? You know, Colin Cowherd said that there's more great games during the NFL season than there are college football. Guess what? College football is not the NFL. In the NFL, every game matters because there's so many teams in the playoff, and teams are trying to win their divisions, or trying to position themselves with a good enough record that they are good enough to get into the playoffs without having to win their division. When you look at college football, though, what makes college football tick isn't the same thing that makes the NFL tick. What makes college football tick is the fandom. You know, certain games may not mean a lot to you, but to the fan base, it means everything. The Civil War between Oregon State and Oregon may not mean a lot to somebody from the East Coast, but it means a lot to those two fan bases and the alumni of their schools. You can't judge how great a game is going to be by looking at it on the schedule and then just assuming that it isn't going to mean anything. The same people who say that college football has a great game shortage are the same people who make it all about the college football playoffs and then have the nerve to go on Twitter and say how these bowl games are meaningless. No, these bowl games ain't meaningless, fam. These bowl games are meaningless to you. I love bowl season. I love the fact that during the middle of December, I can turn my TV on and see a bowl game being played at 6 p.m. in the middle of Thursday or in the middle of the week on Wednesday. I love bowl season. I love watching the Dollar General Bowl, the Duke Mayo Bowl, the Sun Bowl, the Tony the Tiger Stripes Bowl. You feel me? I'm just a fan of college football. And if you're a fan of college football, you're just somebody who just enjoys watching the games overall, not just watching the teams that always have playoff implications on the line, because that's not what this sport has been about. What has made college football so popular has been the pageantry, the fan base, the intensity, you know, the feeling that you get when your favorite team pulls off an upset. And we've lost that luster. It doesn't hit the same anymore. I remember when Boise State was able to upset Georgia and Virginia Tech early in the season. You know, that's what makes college football special. You know, the upsets, the different kinds of fan bases. It's not always about the college football playoffs. It's not the end-all be-all. And that's why people like Colin Cowherd come on and say there's a shortage of great games, because they only pay attention to the games that either have a mega big storyline like Deion Sanders or have two teams competing for the college football playoffs. The two games that Colin Cowherd said interest him the most were TCU, Colorado, and LSU, FSU. And ironically, they just fit both of the narratives that I described. People watch college football games on a national level who only make it about the college football playoffs, only care about games that have mega big storylines, a coach on the hot seat, or a big name coach like Deion Sanders. How are they going to fare? Or a team that has college football implications on the line, or both teams have college football playoff hopes on the line, such as FSU and LSU. You know, there are other great games that are going to be played week one that are going to have the potential to be really good. Utah, Florida could be a classic. Duke, Clemson could be a classic. UNC, South Carolina could be a classic. These all have the capability of being able to be great games. Just because Alabama and a lot of big name schools play some jabronis on a couple of occasions, or Michigan's case nearly every single week, doesn't mean that college football has a big game shortage. Even with you expanding the conferences and adding more teams to the Big Ten, there are still going to be matchups that nobody cares about. Let's just be honest. Nobody gives a damn about watching Purdue and Northwestern. Nobody's going to watch Purdue versus Nebraska as much as they're going to watch Michigan versus Ohio State. Same thing anytime Vanderbilt plays anybody. Nobody's tuning in for a game featuring Vanderbilt. That happens with any conference. Regardless how many teams you add to said conference, there are always going to be some games that are going to be washes. Because not every team in every conference is going to be good. There are just going to be some schools who are going to be the bottom of the barrel, And that's just what it is. You're just going to have some games that just don't have great teams. That doesn't mean there's a great game shortage in college football. I mean, you look at these SEC schools, yeah, they do schedule jabronis and it does upset you. But I mean, let's not act like there aren't a lot of other games being played. People tried to say that Georgia played an easy schedule last year and just forget the fact that they played Oregon week 1 and embarrassed them and clapped them. And Oregon was a really good team. We forget about Tennessee versus Pitt. That was a classic. Utah versus Florida last year was a classic. But I didn't hear nobody bringing up how great those games were because college football playoff implications weren't on the line. The Big Ten plays at noon because they have, you see, with college football, there has to be a better way at scheduling these marquee matchups in a way that they don't undermine each other. You can't have some of your biggest games of the afternoon being played in the same time slot. I can't be watching the Iron Bowl at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, for example, and watching the game between Ohio State and Michigan being played at the same time. You need to spread out your games. Make one big game be played at noon. Make another marquee matchup be played a little bit later in the day. Don't have all these great games on at the same time. And I know there are so many college football teams and there's so many games that get played that you're going to have some overlapping ones, but make your marquee matchups noticeable. Don't have a 1 versus 5 team going up against a 3 versus 10 team at the same time. You know, like, there are plenty of great games. It's just that the games that really get the most attention are the ones that have games featuring playoff teams. And college football isn't all about the college football playoffs. There are other reasons for why games can be good, why games have meaning. And like I said, you can't judge how great a game is going to be based on how it looks on paper.